Number 1. The House. I've heard and read stories by people who've lived in neighborhoods and had a scary house in that neighborhood that all the kids think is haunted. Or something like that. You know, sort of like the house in the original Halloween movie. I heard a lot of those stories growing up, although the neighborhood that we lived in didn't have a house like that. But still, I grew up with this idea that there were haunted houses out there, and that I should try and go find them and explore them. Because unlike children that were scared of the idea of seeing a ghost, I always was more fascinated by it. When I was 12, going on 13, my parents retired. I was the youngest out of a large group of children, but also my dad was pretty successful, so my parents were able to retire at a relatively young age. Except for one brother who was 2 years older than I was, my other siblings had all left home. So my parents decided to retire early, and they wanted to move out to a house in the country. I was excited for the move myself. I had grown up in the city, and in a very well-to-do part of the city. Living out in the country was something that was totally new to me, and I had no idea what to expect. I'd seen plenty of movies and TV shows about country living, and of course, being an impressionable kid, on the edge of 13 years old, I believed that these movies and shows depicted accurate methods of living. I still remember driving on the country roads for the first time in my life. I remember thinking it was weird to have a road paved with a bunch of rocks. You would think that it would end up popping your tires. The amount of trees and bushes were amazing and very beautiful. But I think the thing that stood out the most to me was the old house. We drove by this house on the way to our home. It was obviously very old. It was set back from the road in a yard that was overgrown with trees and shrubs. This made the yard shadier than it would have been otherwise. I mean, it was actually pretty dark. And the entrance to the overgrown driveway of the house was blocked by a metal fence with a no trespassing sign on it. I immediately thought that I had found a haunted house, and I became really interested in it. I was much more interested in it than I was in our own home, which was a nearly brand new house set on a hill with a huge yard. We had a big garden, there was a large playground built in the backyard, and the house had a swimming pool. Although I liked the house a lot, it was nowhere near as appealing as the creepy house that we had seen on our way to it. Over the next few weeks, my parents would very often have to drive into town for things, and each time they went, I was eager to go with them. And each time we drove by that creepy house, I became more and more fascinated with trying to find a way to get into the house. I wanted to do this sometime in the future, so I could explore it, and probably eventually see a ghost. It finally came to pass one day that I was simply asked my parents if it was alright for me to go out exploring. They let me do so as long as I stayed on the road and didn't wander into the forest or anything. And that was ideal for me because that was exactly what I wanted to do anyway. So I set out for the house immediately. It was a bit of a walk. I was never good at gauging the difference in time between a car drive and a walk, so it took me a bit of time to get to the house. But once I did get there, I was excited. The gate in front of the house would be easy to get over. I just was hesitant a little at first because I had heard about electric fences out in the country, so I hesitantly reached out to touch the fence. I was really expecting to have the hell shocked out of me when I touched it, but it was just a regular metal gate. Relieved, I quickly climbed over it and came down on the other side. I won't lie to you, despite the fact that this was what I had always wanted to see, always wanted to do, I was more than a little bit scared. I slowed my walking pace down a bit as I was approaching the house. The house itself was the complete opposite of the house that we had moved into. It was obviously old and in disrepair. The outside walls of the house were wooden boards, something I had never seen before. They were old and a very dark gray, like the entire building itself. Several of the windows had also been boarded up. I went up to the house, and the front door opened quite easily. I could feel my heart beating faster because I was finally getting to get a good look inside the place. The inside of the building was even creepier than the outside. It was dark, of course, which probably explained that. There was furniture and things on the wall, but they were all old and very rotted. Every single step I made a creaking sound that I at first enjoyed. I wasn't in the house very long before I heard something that I did not expect to hear, though. Remember that I had wanted to experience seeing or hearing a ghost. Well, I heard something a lot scarier than a spirit. Did it sound like someone was walking around upstairs? I heard a voice come from what I expected to have been the basement. "Check it out," another voice ordered. I absolutely had not expected that anyone would be in this old, seemingly abandoned building. And while I considered the fact that I was wrong, I also thought that maybe they weren't supposed to be there any more than I was. I heard someone walking up the stairs. I did the only thing I could think of to do in response. I turned and ran back toward the way in. I ran out the door and didn't bother closing the door. As I was running for the gate, I heard someone yelling things behind me, but I can't really remember what was being said. I only knew that the voice sounded pretty angry with me. I jumped over the gate, turned, and ran down the road toward home. I didn't stop until I got home, without looking back over my shoulder even one time. It was also the longest that I'd ever run in my life. I didn't tell my family or anyone else about what happened for a long time. About 2 years later, I did mention it to a friend of mine. He wanted to go back and check the place out. I was very hesitant to do so, but he had a rifle with him that he'd use when he went hunting, so he brought it with him for protection. On exploring the house, there was no one there, but in the basement there was some furniture that was a lot less old and a lot less rotted than the furniture in the rest of the house. There were cots and a table. There were at least enough there for 3 people. I never found out who it was that was in that house, or what they were up to. I guess they never found me either, but regardless of what they were up to, they sure scared the hell out of me that day. Number 2. Riding home. I live with my husband in a beautiful house in the mountains. We've lived here for a very long time. It has its detriments, of course, since everywhere does have theirs. But for the most part, it is very beautiful and a very wonderful place to live. One of the detriments is that, although the ride is very beautiful, it's a really long drive to get to town, or any place we generally need to go. So whenever we do drive into town or elsewhere for something, we will stock up on things so we don't have to do it very often. That's not particularly relevant to the story, but I just wanted to give you a good idea of how far out in the country we actually were. On this particular day, I was driving by myself. My husband chose to stay at home. I did a little bit of shopping, but this was more of a day for me to just be out of the house. It was very beautiful outside that day. One of the places I went to was an antique store. When the weather was nice, they would set up tables outside with their wares on them. And this day was really, really beautiful. It's nice to be able to look for things to buy while you're also looking at the beautiful country backdrop. I hadn't really planned on buying anything unless something had caught my eye, and eventually something did. It's not important what the item was, just that it was pretty expensive. They didn't take credit cards. This was a while back when some places still didn't take them. I always carried enough cash on me, though. When I bought the item, this really creepy-looking fellow was not very far away from me. And even though he wasn't in line to buy anything, he watched us make the transaction. That, of course, made me very nervous, but I tried to not let on that I knew he was watching, and tried not to let on to the fact that it made me nervous. After the transaction, I browsed a little bit more. The guy kept browsing in the same areas that I did, and of course that made me nervous. I kept lingering, hoping that he would go ahead and leave the store before me. He didn't, though. After a while, I figured I would just go. So I went out in my car, started it, and began to drive home. As I was pulling out, I noticed the guy getting into his car as well. I watched, hoping that when he pulled out, that he would go in a different direction than I did. He turned and came in the same direction that I was going, right behind me. I was unnerved a little bit, but tried to not let myself worry about it. But I think I had a valid reason to be worried. He had watched me make a large cash transaction. He had been following me around the store afterward. He left the store immediately after I did, and was now driving in the same direction as I was. I had to turn off on certain roads as I drove along. Each time I turned, I expected him to keep going straight. If he did, I would be able to tell myself that he wasn't following me. I had just got myself worked up over nothing. But he made every turn that I did. It just made me more and more nervous. The nervousness got worse as I began heading up the mountain. As I mentioned, we lived pretty far from town. While I was driving, it began to get later, and the sun began going down, and this creepy guy just kept following me. There were plenty of places for him to turn off, on the mountain as well, but the guy kept following me, and that just made me incredibly nervous the entire time. I suspected that he probably noticed the amount of cash I had on hand, and wanted to follow me home, where he would probably rob me. I have a CB radio in the car. I thought about trying to get in touch with the police. That thought didn't last long, though. It would be hard for them to find me, since I was constantly moving. So instead I radioed my husband, and told him about what was going on. I was absolutely sure that this guy was following me. We talked about it, hoping that the creepy guy was also not on the radio, listening to us talking about him. Despite working something out with my husband, I can't relay to you how terrified I was when we got to my driveway. It was a long driveway, and my house looked like the finish line to a scary race. It wasn't completely dark out yet, and I was able to watch as the creep's car pulled into the driveway behind me. I pulled the car all the way up to the house, and the car behind me followed. I then nervously got out of the car and rushed onto the porch, where my husband had been sitting on the stairs. I watched as the guy got out of his car, something in his hand. My husband rushed me inside the house. He stood up and fired his shotgun in the direction of the creepy guy. Although it was rather dim, I could tell everything that went on after that. The guy had been walking toward the house, but the shotgun blast scared him so much that he fell down on the ground. He dropped whatever it was that he was holding. My husband began walking in his direction. The man scurried to his feet and got back into his car. He hadn't shut it off, so he put it in reverse and backed out of the driveway as fast as he could. He turned out of the driveway and went back the direction that we had come from. My husband went and picked up the item that the man had dropped. It was a crowbar. When he showed it to me, it sent chills down my spine. He was obviously planning on hitting me with it, or maybe worse. The guy didn't come back. That was good for him that he didn't. He had already gotten his only warning shot. Number 3. The hike. The strangest thing that ever happened to me happened when I was a young teenager. I want to say that I was 13 or 14 at the time. One of my favorite activities back then, and even now, was to go on a hike or go camping. It wasn't unusual for me to go alone either. My parents always joked that when I grew up, I would probably end up being a hermit. I haven't, of course, but this was just going to be a hike, not a camping trip, and I decided that I was going to go alone. I went out and was planning on spending the whole day out in the woods. I liked being in that area, and I was absolutely familiar with it as well. The familiarity was what I liked. I went over the hill and down towards this clearing that I'd always liked. It was especially nice in the fall, when the leaves were changing colors. As I was descending down the hill, I noticed something weird. It seemed like some sort of figure was hanging from a tree, but not like hanging from a branch. It appeared to be tied to the trunk of the tree. As I got closer and closer to it, I realized that it was not a real person or anything. It was some sort of scarecrow. It was tied around the chest and feet to the tree. It also appeared to be shot with arrows. I was morbidly fascinated with it. I went all the way down to the tree to look at the scarecrow. I was a bit shocked to see that there was a picture on the scarecrow. It was a face, and it was a face of someone I knew. A guy named Tommy. I was very creeped out by the scarecrow, and didn't really know what to do. I decided that I would just make sure to tell Tommy about it the next time I saw him. The next day in school, I meant to talk to Tommy, but he wasn't at school. I didn't know his phone number or anything like that. So I just waited for him to be at school the next day. Tommy didn't come to school that day. I learned soon after that he went missing the weekend of the time I found that scarecrow. I told the police about the scarecrow, and I showed them where I had found it, but it wasn't there. They told me that they believed me, but if someone had hurt Tommy, they had obviously come back for the scarecrow. Tommy was listed as a missing person. To this day, I have no idea if he has ever been seen again. Hey y'all, Killer Orange Cat here. If you like this video, please let me know by hitting the like button. If you're not already subscribed to Killer Orange Cat, feel free to click the subscribe button and the bell below, or wait for the icon of Ichigo Cat that will appear at the end of this closing. Leave me a comment, and share the video with someone you think might enjoy it. If you have an original story you'd like narrated on Killer Orange Cat, please email it to the address included in the description. But most importantly, don't forget to make sure to check in your closet and check under your bed, because you never know where a Killer Orange Cat might be hiding. Good night.